We are on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. We're on page 13a. And we started the chapter, this new parak, which is called Haya Kairei, if a person was reading in the Torah. And the first point of our chapter was about having kavana, having intent. And the Gemara initially understood it to mean the intent to fulfill the mitzvah. And so the Gemara understood from here that we can answer an old question we've had throughout different areas of the Jewish law. Do you need to have intent when you fulfill a mitzvah? And the Gemara answered that we're not talking about that type of intent to fulfill a mitzvah. We're talking about the intent to recite something. According to Rashi, what it meant was the person had ulterior motives why he was reciting. He was not reciting the words in order to recite them for recital purposes. He was saying them for a different purpose. It was in order to correct the writing. He was a scribe and he's correcting stuff. So he's reading it not for the sake of reading, but for the sake of another purpose. So it has nothing to do with having in mind for the mitzvah or not. It has to do with having in mind what his purpose of reciting. Is it for the sake of reciting, or is it for the sake of another purpose? In this case, correcting. We said Taisvus's explanation was in order to recite the words properly. In other words, he was saying the words without planning on saying the words properly. He was trying to say them in a way that it'll help him correct the words. And then we said a third explanation, that here we're talking about that he is not exactly having in mind to recite the words at all. It's just that the words, it happens to be, he's looking at it, so the words are coming out of his mouth. It's almost like if you're playing with a shofar and you're not actually expecting the sound to come out, and while you're playing and trying to impress and pushing, you're pushing your breath through, all of a sudden a nice shofar sound comes out. So you didn't plan on it happening. You actually were just checking out the shofar and touching it and touching it to your mouth and so on. So the same thing is with reading the words, where you didn't actually have in mind to even read them. You're just correcting something. So that was the three ways of understanding kavana here. These are the three ways. I did want to just say a fourth way, and that is there is an idea here that, let me mute everyone. There is a fourth way, and this is the Rambam's way of understanding this Gemara, and that is that the kavana we're talking about is the meaning of the Shema. This is a whole new explanation, but we're talking about the meaning of the Shema, and the problem the person has is that he's having in mind to say the words in order to correct the Torah, in order to write the Torah properly or to correct the Torah. So he's not having in mind the meaning. So on this, the Gemara says, the Mishnah says that if he's mechavein liba, if he has in mind the meaning of the Shema, accepting the yoke of heaven and so on, then he can fulfill the mitzvah. But if he doesn't have that in mind, he's not going to fulfill the mitzvah. He's got to make sure, even though he's saying the words, he's saying them properly. But since he's doing it, his purpose is to correct something, so he might not be having in mind the meaning of the words. And on this, it says you have to have in mind the meaning of the words. So this adds a new dimension of kavana. So what we have here now is three meanings of kavana. What is kavana? When we talk about kavana, having intent, there's three meanings. The first is actually to do the action, intent to do the either to say the words properly, purpose of saying the words, some type of a different explanations of what intent of saying the words is, but that's the first meaning of kavanah. The second meaning of kavanah is for the purpose of the mitzvah. Is he doing it for a mitzvah or he's doing it for some other purpose? Does he have in mind for the mitzvah to fulfill the mitzvah? The third intent is the intent of the meaning of the words. Is he having concentration on what he's saying in the meaning of the word? So these are three meanings of kavanah that we are dealing with. And based on the different meanings, that's the way of reading the Gemara. That's the way you could understand the Gemara. Okay, and then the Gemara that we learned yesterday was all about saying the Shema in another language. And so what is the halacha? What does our Gemara say about saying Shema in another language? Can you read the Shema from your English Siddur? A lot of people don't read Hebrew. So the question is, can they fulfill the Shema from reading it in an English Siddur? Now, there's two types of English. There's translation and there's transliteration. Transliteration is English letters, but you're saying the Hebrew words. Now, if you need to say Shema in Hebrew, that would mean that the English Siddurim should make it possible for a Jew to fulfill the mitzvah of Shema, and they should write a transliterated Shema in order for a person to fulfill the mitzvah. If you need to say Shema in Hebrew, right? That's what it should. That's what the English Siddurim should do, because they're servicing the English readers. They should write the Shema in a transliterated way. So it would be English letters, because the person that doesn't read Hebrew, they would have it written in a transliterated way. If you can say Shema in English, then the English translation is good enough. You don't need it transliterated. English would be good enough. Now, I will mention something very interesting, that the English Siddurim, I believe the Rebbe had a big problem with the Art Scroll translation. Why did the Rebbe have a problem with the English translation of Art Scroll? Because they translate Hashem's name, they translate God's name as Hashem. Now, if someone wants to fulfill the mitzvah of Shema, and they say Hashem, they are not actually fulfilling the mitzvah of Shema, because Hashem is a way of referring to God's name, but it's not God's name. And if you want to fulfill the mitzvah of Shema, you have to say God. You cannot say Hashem. So I think the Rebbe wrote them a letter saying that they should, fix it, because they're trying to service the English speakers, and the people who are going to read the English will not be fulfilling the mitzvah properly. And so I know in the Lubavitch, they made sure to do it correctly, because the goal is to help those that might not say it in English to recite it, to fulfill the mitzvah. The people who don't know Hebrew, that they should fulfill the mitzvah. Of course, the English Siddur as well is very nice, that it helps even people who read Hebrew. They should understand what they're saying. I'm not disagreeing with that. That's a wonderful purpose as well. But there is a major, there's a huge amount of people out there that don't read Hebrew, and they have an opportunity to say Shema and fulfill the mitzvah in English. That at least it should be written that way, that they could fulfill it they could fulfill it in English. So, it should be translated properly and not just using the word Hashem, which causes you not to fulfill the mitzvah properly. As we will be learning later, that you have to be careful when you use a translation, that you can't use slang words. It can't use, it has to be specific. It has to be exact. When you use a translation in order to fulfill the mitzvah, you gotta use the exact words. You have to be careful in the shibush, it says, in the certain slangs and other. You have to make sure that it's a good translation. So that is the discussion in our Gemara. Does it have to be in Hebrew, or could you say the Shema in English? And does anyone know what did our Gemara say? Does it have to be in Hebrew, or could it be in English? Anyone?
The rabbi said
think
all
there was-
languages.
What did you say, Ezra? The rabbis say what?
All languages.
All languages. Okay, the rabbis say all languages. And was there another opinion? Anyone? Well, is there one other opinion? I know the rabbi said all languages. Thank you, Ezra. Another opinion?
You have to say it in the language that you understand, I think.
Okay, but that's all languages, but you have to understand them. Okay, that's a good point. Thank you for adding that, Ben. You got to make sure to understand them. It has to be that you understand those languages. But is there another opinion?
Yes, Rebbe's opinion, it has to be in Hebrew.
Thank you, Howard. So Rebbe holds it does have to be in Hebrew. Now, what is the source of these opinions? There's two words. One learns it from one word, the other learns it from a different word. One says it has to be Hebrew because of, there's a word in the Shema that implies it has to be a certain way in Hebrew. The other one learns it could be in any language because of another word in the Shema that implies it could be any language. What are the sources? What are the two words that we're arguing about? Yes, Ben. Yes.
I think that one word is Elohim,
No.
Which word? What did you say?
which in different languages is
No.
pronounced different words, not just pronunciation.
Uh-huh. I didn't hear the word. What was the
For
word?
Elohim, you use
Elohim?
in
No, not
different
Elohim.
languages, you use different words.
No, not Argamar. Argamar doesn't say that. Okay, anyone know what the words are that we're arguing about?
Rebbe says Vehayu, and the Rabbanim says Shema.
Okay, thank you, Ezra. So Rebbe says Vahayu, it has to be this way, means in Hebrew. And the rabbis say it says Shema, which means you have to understand. Any language you understand, as long as you understand it, you fulfill the mitzvah in any language. Shema b'chol lashon, any language that you can hear, that you can understand, that's way of fulfilling the Shema. So the rabbis went back and forth. Why doesn't Rebbe, what does he do with the word Shema? And what do the rabbis do with the word Vahayu? So let's go through this. What do the rabbis do with the word Vahayu? So the rabbis use the word Vahayu to teach us that it has to be in order. Have Yoson Yehu, it has to be in order. And how does Rebbe know about that it has to be in order? He uses Vahayu to tell you it has to be in Hebrew. So what does he do with the word Vahayu? So the Gemara says that he learns that it has to be in order, that you can't read it backwards, and because it says Vahayu Hadvarim. These words should be this way, Hadvarim, these words, meaning it has to be in this order and not in another order. And what do the rabbis do with those words? Hadvarim, the fact that it says these words, meaning it has to be in order. Why don't the rabbis learn it from that verse, or where do they use that verse? And they say that they don't see it so clearly in that word, Hadvarim, and therefore they use the word Vahayu to teach you that it has to be in order and not backwards. And they use the word Shema to teach you in any language. Now let's jump to Rebbe. What does Rebbe do with the word Shema? Shema sounds like it could be in any language. What does Rebbe say about Shema? What does Rebbe do with that word, Shema? Anyone?
You must hear your words.
That you have to hear what you're saying. You can't just say words, you have to actually hear it. Which comes out that there's three ways of saying, of reciting things. Some people read with their eyes, then there's reading with your mouth, and then there's reading that you can hear it. And Rebbe says you have to actually hear it. You have to say it and hear it. Now, in general, in Torah, we always say that you have to say it. Here, reading with your eyes is generally not fulfilling the mitzvah of Shema, especially, but it has to be. And then in Talmud Torah itself, there's discussion about if you study Torah, do you have to say Birchas HaTorah, the blessings of the Torah, if you just read with your eyes? Would you have to say the blessings on the Torah? Or is that not, reading with your eyes, is that not considered studying Torah? So you wouldn't need to say the blessing. That's a discussion. And we did touch upon it before, maybe we'll come to it later. But the idea of reading the Shema, Rebbe says you have to read it with your mouth and you have to hear yourself, hear the words. Now, what is, loud enough that you could hear the words. Now, the rabbis, how do they know that law, or do they not follow that law? Do the rabbis say you need to hear it with hear what you're saying? In other words, they're using the word Shema to tell you every language, so they don't have that verse. They don't have that extra word to tell you that you need to hear what you're saying. So do they learn that from another verse, or do they not hold of that? How do they know about that law? Yes, Ben.
I think they were saying that you don't really have to hear it. You just have to use your mouth
to say it,
not your eyes to read it.
Right. So that's correct. The rabbis
you don't necessarily have to hear it.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you. So according to the rabbis, you don't have to. They don't hold you need to hear it. At least it's kosher, even if you didn't hear it, and therefore they don't use the word Shema for that. They use the word Shema for that any language that you understand. Okay, we're right at the end of this discussion, and so let's go to, it's about 4 lines up from the bottom of the page, or maybe 5 lines up from the bottom of the page. Lememra, yes, first word on Lememra. So we're right at the end of 13a, the end of 13a. And 5 lines up from the bottom. Lememra, does this mean to say that if we're saying Rebbe holds the Shema needs to be recited in Hebrew, that implies that Rebbe holds that everything else in the Torah could be other languages. And here it has to specify, you know what? Shema's got to be Hebrew. That sounds like, oh, everything else could have been English. Here it has to tell you, by the way, Shema, you got to do Hebrew. What does that imply? It sounds like everything else, you don't have to do Hebrew. So Lememra, the Sava Rebbe, does this mean to say, are you saying that Rebbe holds the Chol HaTorah Kula, the entire Torah, B'chol Lashon Nemra, can be recited in any language? Now, what the Gemara exactly means here is unclear. What does it mean? The entire Torah can be said in other languages. What entire Torah? What does that mean? So one way of understanding this is that when you read it, the mitzvah of reading the Torah in shul, maybe you could read it in other languages. That's one way of understanding this. Another way of understanding it is that we're talking about, but the problem with that, Tosfos has a problem with that. He says there's no mitzvah to read the Torah in shul. In other words, there's no biblical obligation to read the Torah in shul. So how could the Torah tell you that Shema you need to do Hebrew? Because the rest of the Torah you could say in English, which would mean that you could read the Torah in shul in English, and for every Shabbos you could read the Torah in English theoretically. That's what it's implying, but that's not true. There's no obligation to read the Torah in shul biblically, and therefore the Torah, you can't say that the Torah is saying this word because it's excluding it from the regular law that you are obligated to read the Torah. There's no obligation in the Torah to read the Torah every Shabbos in shul, or every Monday and Thursday, or every Shabbos mincha, or every holiday. It doesn't say clearly in the Torah that you have to do that. It's a rabbinic institution to read the Torah in shul. Rabbinic, either Moses established it. There's a discussion. The Rambam brings that there's a little contradiction, because one place it says Ezra established it, another place it says Moshe established it to read the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays. So the simple explanation is Moshe established to read the Torah on Mondays and Thursdays, and on Shabbos, and on Mondays and Thursdays. And Ezra established how many people are called up. Ezra established that that there's Mondays and Thursdays is 3 people, and 3 people are called up to the Torah, and so on. So that's how they would, but it's not biblical, it's rabbinic. So how could we, so what do we mean over here? So Tosfos says, we're talking about Parshas Zohar, which is the Torah portion. I believe it's the Shabbos before Purim, is always Parshas Zohar, which means Parshas Shuvah. Next Shabbos, we're going to read Parshas Zohar. So according to Tosfos here, this is the source that it's biblical. And so the question our Gemara is mentioning is, according to Rebbe, when you read portion of the Shema, when you say Shema, that's got to be Hebrew, according to Rebbe. This implies that the portion of Zachar next week, when they're going to read in the Torah Zachar, you can fulfill the mitzvah if it's read in English. That's the way Tosfos understands it, that Zachar is biblical. It's a biblical obligation to read next week's Torah portion, not the entire Torah portion. The portion that they read at the end, that they repeat, that's Parshas Kiseitze. There's a paragraph that they read at the end of the Torah portion from another Torah scroll. So that portion is going to be a biblical obligation. The rest of the Torah is rabbinic. Of course, it's an obligation to read it. But the Parsha of Zachar, that's biblical. And that's what the Torah, that's what the Gemara here is discussing. Would you be able to read that in English? According to Rebbe, it says specifically Shema's be Hebrew. Maybe Zachar could be English. And the same thing, maybe the week called Parshas Hara, which is as well, which is the portion of Kisisa, which is the 2 weeks later. Would that as well could possibly be biblical according to some opinions? That's also biblical. So anyway, this is a Tosfos over here mentions that Parshas Zachar would be a biblical obligation. Another way of understanding this, what the obligation that we're talking about here, the entire Torah could be in other languages, possibly means. Let me just get the Ritva speaks about this, and he says. Number one is a Torah scroll written in other languages. Would that have holiness? That's another way of understanding this. And the Raavad learns it's talking about would you be allowed to learn Torah? Would you fulfill the mitzvah of learning Torah if you don't learn it in Hebrew? That's what we're talking about. That's quite an interesting thought, that possibly you would need to learn Torah in Hebrew. Wow, that's an interesting thought, that you would need to learn Torah in Hebrew. So that's the Gemara's question here. Now, so what is the Gemara's answer? The Gemara's answer over here is that, let me get my Gemara here. The Gemara's answer here is that really, no, it's not telling you that you would think that the entire Torah could be needs to be it could be in any language, and only Shema has to be Hebrew. Again, I'm jumping back and forth. According to Rebbe, there's a thought that maybe the entire Torah could be in any language. And here it specifically has to be Hebrew by Shema. And the Gemara answers that no, the only reason it needs to specifically tell us that Shema has to be Hebrew is really because Mishum Dichsiv Shema. Because it says Shema, which implies any language, so here it specifically has to tell you Shema has to be in Hebrew. But the rest of the Torah maybe also has to be Hebrew. Maybe you would need to learn Torah in Hebrew. Maybe you would need to write the Torah scroll has to be Hebrew. Maybe all the readings of the Torah have to be specifically in Hebrew. And however you're going to learn this Gemara, each way, according to its way, that you don't have any proof to the rest of the Torah, because here in Shema, the problem we have is that one verse implies it could be any language. So therefore, Rebbe says, therefore, you need a specific verse to tell you, no, this specifically has to be Hebrew. But it doesn't show us anything about the rest of the Torah, because the rest of the Torah doesn't have a verse that implies the wrong thing. Here on Shema, you have a verse that implies the wrong thing. Therefore, it needs a specific verse to clarify it. So again, according to Rebbe, you need a specific verse to say Shema has to be Hebrew. Why do you need a specific verse that Shema has to be Hebrew? The rest of the Torah also maybe has to be Hebrew, because you need a specific verse, because there's a verse that seems to imply that it could be any language, the word Shema. Shema implies maybe it could be any language. Rebbe says, therefore, I'm saying it says v'hayu to tell you that don't get any wrong understanding. V'hayu, it also has to be Hebrew. So it's not necessarily teaching you anything about the rest of the Torah. Now, the same thing applies to the rabbis. Lememra de Sava Rabbanon, does this mean to tell you that the rabbis hold the Kol HaTorah Kula B'Lashon HaKodesh Nemra, that the entire Torah has to be Hebrew? And here again we have all three explanations. Does it mean that the Torah has to be read in Hebrew? Does the Torah has to be written in Hebrew? Does the Torah have to be studied in Hebrew? The rest of the Torah, and therefore the rabbis say Shema can be any language. Why is the rabbi saying Shema could be any language? They're implying, because obviously they're saying the rest of the Torah can't be any language. Here it has to specifically tell you that it could be any language. That's what it sounds like. The rest of the Torah probably all has to be Hebrew. If you're going to say that the entire Torah can be in any language, Shema de Kosav Rachbana Lamali, the Shema that the Torah writes, the word Shema that the Torah writes, that you can say it in any language. Lamali, what do I need it for? The whole Torah is automatically in all languages. Why would the Torah have to write Shema? The word Shema, which means all languages. It must be because the rest of the Torah is not in all languages. It only is in Hebrew. You can only do the rest of the Torah in Hebrew. The Gemara answers, no, Itzrich. We need here by Shema to say the word Shema, that you can say it in any language, Mishum Dechsiv V'hayu, because it says V'hayu, which implies the opposite, and implies it has to be in Hebrew. Therefore, it has to, according to the rabbis, you have to specifically have the word Shema here to tell you that don't get any wrong understanding. Just because it says V'hayu, don't get the wrong implication, and therefore Shema is in all languages, and really the entire Torah also might be in all languages. But here we have to emphasize that it could be in all languages, because you might learn it wrong. You might get the wrong idea from the fact that it says V'hayu. Okay, so I think that we've completed this Gemara, and my time is up. If anyone wants